What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be taking a look at a new Warhammer community MetaWatch article that talks about some of the methods that the Warhammer 40k design team uses to balance the game. In this article, they include a summary of some of the statistics that they've gathered for games of Warhammer 40,000 in the Nephilim format, and I think it gives us a really good insight into how they're approaching the game from a balanced standpoint and the changes that we can expect from the new and upcoming balanced data slate. Within the next 1 to 2 weeks, we should expect a big change to the game that's going to shake up the metagame in a big way, so be prepared for that. And I think this article gives us a real good hint at what we can expect to change there. Alongside the article also comes a MetaWatch video, an interview with Stu Black, one of the studio heads of the Warhammer 40k design and development studio. So what we're going to be doing today is going through the article as well as the included faction win rate ranking that the development team is using, talking about some of the insights we can glean from that on their process, and then going through that interview and talking about some of the key points that Stu brings up. And with that, let's get into it. So we're going to do this classic YouTube thing where I put myself in the corner of the video as we go through the article, so let's dive right into that. And obviously this article is from the 6th of October, 2022, the date that this video is being released. Now, the MetaWatch articles in the past have been kind of full of corporate company speak, which I haven't really been a fan of, but this one actually seems pretty transparent. Now, first thing that they talk about here in this calculation section is how the team is trying to keep factions within a 45 to 55% win rate, which I think is very appropriate. That's a pretty solid goal for the entirety of the game. And one thing that they do talk about in this article and in the interview that's attached to it is that the meta is in its most condensed state that it has been in the entirety of 9th edition's existence, which I wholeheartedly agree with, and I think most people who play competitively right now will agree that the game is definitely the most balanced that it's probably been since 8th edition. At least I might remember a lot of 8th edition with a little bit rose tinted classes, because that's when I started playing more modern 40k, and when I got into the game it felt very balanced, but I'm not sure that that was actually the case. Now, importantly, we do go through the data that the team has gathered, and this gives us some good insights into how they're approaching the balance of individual factions. While this data is relatively consistent with what we see gathered by other sources, they don't give exact references for where they got these. They just talk about how they've gathered data from over 100,000 games of Warhammer 40k. It is heavily implied in the interview that this data is from Best Coast pairings, although they don't go so far as to say that. But they also say that they've taken aggregate data from other data collection sources. But mostly I would imagine that this is from Best Coast pairings. And an interesting thing about that is that they do mention in the interview that they are looking at the competitive game holistically, whereas a lot of data sources are going to be cutting out RTT level events because they can have a little bit of a skewing effect on data, and they tend to be slightly less competitive than big 5-round GT level events and larger. Because the design team, I think, is trying to take more of an egalitarian approach and balance the game across all levels of skill, it sounds like they are also taking RTT data into account. So if some of these numbers look a little condensed from what you'd expect, that would be the reason. Not only because they are short, so oftentimes you'll have multiple undefeated players who don't have the opportunity to play against each other. So sometimes the two most competitive people in an event will not actually fight. But also, because the overall skill level at RTTs tends to be a little more skewed, you actually have more of a chance to win and accrue more wins with an underpowered faction, as long as you can be paired against people with a lesser skill level than you. It's one of the reasons I actually really like RTTs, is because they definitely feel a little bit more wide open, and people feel more comfortable bringing their favorite pet faction rather than trying to adopt the metagame. But it definitely isn't quite as a competitive data set as a GT level. So with that in mind, the numbers we have here and what we can basically attribute to be a GW approved faction power ranking are Tyranids and Harlequins as number 1 and 2. Interestingly, Ynnari coming in at number 3 with Adeptus Sororitas, Necrons and Chaos Demons nipping at their heels. Now, the Chaos Demons is really interesting because the Demons Codex is still incredibly new. That 54% win rate is probably based on a really small data set, especially since there are a lot of Chaos Demons included in other lists like Heretic Astartes and especially Thousand Sons. But it doesn't look like they're dissecting multi-faction lists. So I don't know if those aren't included at all or are just rolled into whatever majority faction they might be using. Now, there's some pretty telling stuff at the bottom as well. We have Adeptus Mechanicus as the lowest in the game, and that's followed up nearby by Adeptus Astartes. A note that we have here, and we do have a little asterisk on Adeptus Astartes, is that the designers have essentially only split Space Marines with each of their supplement chapters. So the Codex compliant chapters, those being off the top of my head, Imperial Fists, Raven Guard, Ultramarines, Salamanders, White Scars, Iron Hands, are all going to be rolled together into that overall Adeptus Astartes win rate. So this means that while I have talked about it in the past when I went over all the Space Marine chapters, armies like Raven Guard and Imperial Fists are widely considered, and the data backs it up, as some of the worst armies in the entire game with the lowest win rate. Those armies are being rolled in with all of the other Space Marine chapters, whereas chapters like Iron Hands and Salamanders have a lot more tools in the metagame and actually perform a lot higher. Now, this is a really interesting debate when it comes to data collection in Warhammer 40k, because Space Marines are really unique in that their individual sub-factions are much more transformative than sub-factions out of other factions might be. And while even rolling together the supplement chapters like Blood Angels and Space Wolves with the Codex compliant chapters may technically be correct, given that those are all Adeptus Astartes armies, there is no doubt that, for example, a Blood Angel's win rate is going to be dramatically different than a Codex compliant chapter win rate, and even within the Codex compliant chapters, all of those are going to be different. Now, for most factions, that's not a big deal, but Adeptus Astartes is such a big data set that there are oftentimes more players of an individual Space Marine chapter than there are players for all of the sub-factions of any other army. The fact that Space Marine supplements tend to have more individual rules in them, as well as things like secondary objectives and additional stratagems, more so than any other faction in the game, means that those sub-factions striate much more dramatically than anyone else in the game. I don't know if there's a right answer to whether or not they should all be considered in the same army when you're collecting data or not. It sounds like the design team here has basically just said that, sometimes they don't get sub-faction identity from each Adeptus Astartes result, and for that reason, they're just going to go ahead and staple them all together as an Adeptus Astartes score, which does mean that I think it's artificially lower than it actually should be. Because there's a predominance of sub-factions in Adeptus Astartes that don't perform as well as the better sub-factions in other armies, I do think that Adeptus Astartes win rate is lower than what the faction could potentially, in the platonic ideal of a Space Marine army, actually get to. If you were to play sort of a classic Iron Hands list, which in my opinion is the best Codex compliant Adeptus Astartes list, but I also think White Scars and Salamanders have pretty good builds as well. You could certainly enter that 45 to 50% win rate, but that is dropped down by Imperial Fist and Raven Guard at somewhere around a 25 to 30%. I do think that it's important to note when we're considering the potential for changes in the future that we may not see changes to individual Astartes sub-factions, instead to the faction as a whole. So if you're an Imperial Fist player and you're sad that your Imperial Fist army is not doing well, I don't know if I would be expecting changes to Imperial Fists individually. I would expect changes more along the lines of Armor of Contempt that we got, where a change to every Space Marine unit or points breaks within the Codex across the board are the tools that they're going to be implementing to increase that Astartes win rate over changing individual chapter abilities. Now, there's some interesting stats in here that I don't recognize having looked at the stats previously. Adeptus Custodes at 53% really surprises me, and I do wonder if that's an effect of the inclusion of RTT data instead of just GT data, because Custodes tend to, in GT events, hit bad matchups a lot more often than other factions. Being a low model count faction that relies on very specific types of saving throws and defensive stat lines to protect it means that a lot of times you hit, mass mortal wounds, you hit armies with a really bad profile matchup into, for example, Shield Guard Custodian, and you have a really bad day, and you end up, potentially dropping that game. It feels like a very good, sort of 3-2 faction. But if you're in an RTT, not only are the chances of you hitting those less before you go 3-0, but also you have more of an opportunity to outplay your opponent in that situation, which I think bumps you up a couple pips. We also see things like Knights, Imperial Knights in around the 50%, Pure Azyuriani at 51, but Yannari at 55. And that's been a real big push recently from Craft Worlds players who've moved off, Hail of Doom since it was nerfed to going to Yannari. And I think that is a faction alongside Harlequins where the skill set of the player is hugely important. So I imagine that between Ynnari and Harlequins, the actual data set between those two factions is relatively low, but it's being buoyed up by some very, very good Ynnari and Harlequin players. Now, moving on from what is ostensibly this official power ranking, they do talk about a little bit about why Adeptus Astartes may be at the 39%. I talked about how the differentiation of factions has a really big impact, but also a really good point, and one that gets brought up a lot when it comes to Adeptus Astartes, is the fact that they are oftentimes pushed as a new player army. So if you're new, you're going to your first tournament ever, and you just bought Space Marines, you got a couple of, the command box starter sets, and you have some intercessors and some Space Marine lieutenants, and you go to an event, you're probably not going to win that too many games, because not only do you have a Space Marine army, which is already sort of hamstringing yourself, you may not be in a very optimal chapter, and your build is probably going to be suboptimal. Further down, they do talk similarly that factions like Harlequins and Genestealer cults tend to have a higher skill ceiling, so they, while have a smaller player base, tend to do well on an individual level, because individual players will be able to pilot those factions to greater success than the player just starting out with them. They dive into this further, talking about some normal statistical anomalies, where factions with a lower play rate will have a bit more divergent results, just based on the fact that individual player skill and individual game results can have a much more dramatic impact on those games. They also talk about Leagues of Votann, where Leagues of Votann haven't had a chance to make their mark on the competitive scene, to quote the article verbatim, which makes it even stranger that they changed them before they were able to make that mark on the competitive scene. Leagues of Votann obviously having received massive nerfs in huge points cost increases before the actual full release of the faction. I think that Leagues of Votann will probably end up around that 50% win rate, but who knows? It might be that judgment tokens turn out to be way more broken than we thought, and even with 25% points of cost increases, it's not that big of a deal. So now what I'd like to do is go through the MetaWatch video and basically do a little bit of a live reaction. We're really like diving into old school YouTuber technology here.
Talk about all things Warhammer 40,000, and who better to join me than the head of the Warhammer 40,000 studio himself, Mr. Stu Black. How you doing, man? You all right?
Yeah, very good, thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me
here. Thank you.
Now, I don't know if I recognize Stu Black, but Games Workshop's reticence to credit their designers to prevent them from being made the face of poor games design decisions has made it difficult to get to know the Games Workshop design team in the past. It sounds like he's the studio head. I'm not sure if he's actually the lead designer and how much personal input he has on the design process, but it does seem like he's a pretty smart dude. And some of the things that he talks about in this video are actually pretty intelligent. So maybe we should hold our criticism of Stu Black and until we get a little bit farther forward.
How do you record those results? Where do those results come from? Do you use every tournament around the world, or have you gaming Bugmans?
That would be amazing, wouldn't it? If we could somehow just deploy like a swarm of servo skulls to kind of like watch every game. No, so what
that's
we do
dystopian.
Things. So we have like direct links with a load of tournament organisers, both directly but also through our kind of global events team. And we also collect data from games all over the place, directly through some of like the well-known gaming apps that people use to run tournaments. We collect all of that data, but also data as reported online. So for people who love 40k stats, there's a lot of it out there, and so we look both data that we gather ourselves, but also that data that's kind of collated and gathered elsewhere as well. Mash all of that into our like picture of what we're looking at. The other thing we try and do is we're not looking at every game that was ever played ever.
Of course, yeah.
So what we want to try and do is keep it relatively up to date.
So one thing that's interesting to talk about here is that they have stated that their data is gathered from, quote unquote, well-known gaming apps. That basically means West Coast pairings, right? I'm pretty sure that's maybe Tabletop TO. I know there's some Warhammer 40k events that run on there, but I think for the most part, it's going to be BCP statistics. Now, they talk about reviewing other data sources, and I know there's a lot of other community-driven sources that have also collated this data, but they don't mention that actually entering their kind of statistical engine. So I think what they probably do is have their own criteria for accepting results, but they'll use the other people in the community who are collating data to inform that.
We'll remember if they've been playing 40k a lot over the last 3-4 years, there's certain times where armies are cresting and they're like doing super well, and other times when they're not. And actually, we don't really want to know how well, I don't know, orcs were doing 2 years ago when buggies were a thing and everyone was super excited about those kind of army lists. We're really looking at the last probably 50 to 100 days, something like that, kind of rolling data to try and keep it relevant.
How do you then go about trying to get them all near to each other? So you might have some armies that are on like 45% win rate, which is okay. But you might have some that are on like 30% or some that are on maybe 60%. How do you go about like balancing those into each other?
Yeah, so we have several tools. So we review the points values of every model in the game, all 1,000 odd of them, every 6 months.
That's some job.
That is, and in the last year we've really moved that to being a digital like delivery system. So again, we can be much more up to date with it.
Yeah.
So that's a big tool that we have. You know, how many points something costs is reflective of how good it is in the game, and so we can tune things based on the points values. And we do that every summer and every winter. So January and June-ish. We try and avoid like big major events, or releasing it on Christmas Day would be a bit pointless. So we try and kind of work around like real life things. And the other tool that again loads of people will be familiar with is the balanced data slate that we use, and that's a quarterly tool that we deploy, where we look at, like you say, those armies maybe that are overperforming for some reason. We might make some changes to them, or actually armies, and probably more importantly for us, armies that are kind of underperforming, and we'll make some changes for those to give them a boost.
So one thing that's really interesting here that I kind of love is that Stu is expounding the benefits of a digital distribution platform, at least for Warhammer points. It's almost like we should move away from in-print media for our rules, Stu. Maybe we can think about that. I'm sure that's not the actual design studios and development studios' purview. I'm sure that's a corporate SOP, but it would be cool if we could get rid of codexes, maybe.
So let's talk the juicy data then. What's doing well right now, and maybe what's not doing quite as well?
It's a good question. It's a good question. So if we start with the things that are doing very well, still kind of at the top of the tree, as it were, are Harlequins and Tyranids. And that's been true for quite some time, and we've, in previous data slates, intervened in those two factions. And
now, interestingly, the Harlequins data in there, I think that they don't really talk about this in the article, but I did expound on it a little bit, is going to be much smaller than that Tyranid data. Tyranids are much more established as a powerhouse faction, I think, whereas Harlequins is much more dependent, in my experience, on player skill. And I'm almost a little worried if Harlequins get hit too hard. The other potential issue there is that has a compounding effect throughout the rest of the Eldari super faction, where now that so many factions like Drukhari and Ynnari are relying on traveling player troops or Harlequins inside other Eldari detachments, if Harlequins' low play rate but high win rate earns them a significant nerf that could actually take the rest of Eldar with them. And I'm a little bit worried about that.
And that certainly had some impact. Maybe not as far as we'd like. So they're both sitting at kind of between 55 and 60 at the moment. So they are in the kind of naughty boy zone that we want to do something about.
Is that literally what it's called in the studio, please?
Yeah, so we have some giant posters that we update every...
I have a naughty boy zone in my studio too.
It's like a big bar
So
chart.
it's for a different purpose, though.
I think we might put a small version of that in the accompanying article. But and it's like the winners and losers. It tracks win rates. They're red or green or orange, depending on whether they're where we want them to be, really not where we want them to be, or close enough.
That means if your army's underperforming at the moment, you can pretty be confident that you guys know about that.
Yes.
And you're on the ball.
Yeah.
And if you know that every time you play Harlequins you're getting beaten into the floor,
yes.
you know that, great, that's really
good. And it's worth saying, I think, that we've been recording this data now for probably, like in this format, probably 2 years. Certainly since the start of the current edition of 40k, and this is the tightest grouping that we've had. Obviously, the Emperor's work is never done. But we're pretty happy at the moment with like overall where we're at. So we've got those two outliers at the top. There's a couple of others that we're keeping an eye on because they're trending upwards, but they're still in the okay zone at the moment. So the Sisters of Battle, the Adeptus Raritas, and Necrons are both doing well. They're sitting right at the kind of 55, 54 kind of mark. So they're on the edge, but they're still in the safe zone. So we've got our eye on those, and we'll watch that over the next coming months and see. Do they stay there? Do they edge up into the danger zone, or do they kind of sink back towards the middle?
Now he mentions here that he's going to be taking a look at those factions in particular, Adeptus Sororitas and Necrons, over the course of the coming month. what it sounds like to me is that maybe they're trying to collate a little bit more data before they move to potentially nerfing those factions. One thing that I would be really worried about is the knock-on effect of implementing nerfs to Harlequins and Tyranids. So if we put some hefty work into Harlequins and Tyranids and we push them down to, let's say 52%, now there isn't any, I shouldn't say there isn't anything, but there's less that's preventing a faction like Necrons, which has in the past been incredibly dominant. And in the past, I mean, within the last 2 months, upon the release of Warzone Nephilim, when the Necron secondaries were updated, they were super strong because they were coming off the back of immense buffs, and there were less tools in the metagame to deal with them. But now we have, these Eldari players fighting them. Tyranids keep them down. I think Tyranids are generally favored in that matchup. And one thing I'd be worried about is that if we see those, we see those two factions, Sororitas and Necrons, at 55%, the development team goes, that's fine. They're at 55%. That's good. But then their predators are removed. I would be worried that those factions would then replace Tyranids and Harlequins at that 60% win rate. So I just hope that we don't see big changes to the top 2 or 3 factions in the game without keeping in mind that that's just going to create new top meta factions. And that's not the goal. The goal is to compress everyone down, but just having them replace each other isn't what we're trying to go for here.
How about the armies that maybe aren't doing quite so well right now?
Yeah, again, great question. So there's also 2. So it's very neat at the moment. So there's 2 that we are keeping an eye on at the moment. So they are...
It's neat if you...
Space Marines. That's worth saying.
Put all of these Space Marine sub-factions together. So it's kind of neat if you make it neat.
Angels or Blood Angels. So if they're at an event or whatever, they're building their army list, they're ticking that box of so I guess that's covering things like your Ultramarines, White Scars, those that aren't one of the Blood Angels, Dark Angels.
And the supplements, the books.
Supplements, exactly. And Adeptus Mechanicus. Adeptus Mechanicus have had a very interesting journey throughout the edition.
They were flying high, weren't they?
They have, yeah. They're probably a good example.
I don't know if that's intentional, but flying high may be a dig at AdMech planes, because time was last year, Adeptus Mechanicus actually necessitated a change to the core rules of Warhammer 40,000 in order to curb their power level, because the AdMech flyer list with triple Stratoraptor, triple Fusilov was, I think, probably... I would go out on a limb and say it was the most broken list in 9th edition. And I think that even the powerhouse factions that we complain about right now, Tyranids currently super strong, these scoring factions super strong. Necrons might have had a chance to beat them because they're scoring so well, but I think a lot of other factions in the game would actually just fall apart to OG AdMech flyers, where you had 6 planes with almost full rerolls to hit, ridiculous survivability, and that's backed up by between 10 and 15 Iron Strider Ballistari. I don't know if that flying comment is a dig at that list, but I kind of hope that it is. That would be pretty referential, and I'd appreciate that.
We've intervened in a balanced data slate. We've had a couple of goes, to be honest, at that. And now they've probably gone a bit too far.
Okay.
And that's a good example of the meta's changed. So we haven't changed them since probably a year ago, where we did intervene quite strongly in the balanced data slate. And that brought them down to a sensible place. But then the game's changed around them, so it's not that we've continued to make to put pressure on them to pull them down. The game itself started to do that. People have started to play around them. Other armies become more popular choices.
Power creep happens,
and that's really kind of depressed the Adeptus Mechanicus win rate. So there's the Adeptus Mechanicus and Adeptus Astartes we're both looking at for the next balanced data slate. They should get some help. To kind of help nudge them back up in the right direction.
So some pretty clear messaging there. If you are playing Adeptus Astartes or Mechanicus, then you should expect some buffs. That's pretty cool. Interesting, they didn't mention that a lot of the changes that they had made previously to the Adeptus Mechanicus faction had already been rolled back in the previous data slate, which is something that I didn't even catch when I was doing my videos on them, because again, there's no change notes for these data slate updates, which is very problematic when they remove nerfs from them. But things like Iron Strider Ballistari gaining core back have made them much more powerful, but the downside right now is that I think, compared to a lot of things in the metagame, they're still suffering under the effect of previous points cost increases. I do think Adeptus Mechanicus has legs. I don't personally think that they have to go far to bring them up to that 50 to 55% win rate, but they certainly do need some help.
That's really cool. So how do you take the information you've just given us there, like the win rates, and then deliver it to the rules designers, and what
Sure.
do they do with it when they get it?
We work with, obviously, the rules designers themselves, so we have our internal games dev team, but we also work quite closely with, as I mentioned earlier, the global events team and their links with tournament organisers from all over the world.
Yeah.
You know, so the big tournaments that everyone will know the names of, but also guys that are organising much smaller events around, you know, all different parts, you know, Australia, Europe, America, like all over the place. We work with those guys, and then we also have a really dedicated and hard-working playtester team who give up their spare time to help us make Warhammer great.
Do they?
And we work with those.
Do
guys.
they have one of those?
So, what is it that's driving the win rate of Harlequins right now? What are those things? Trying to diagnose the root cause. And once we've got those, then we can start thinking, okay, what do we do about it? You know, is it as simple as a change to a rule? Is it actually to do with how this unit interacts with this other unit, which interacts with this stratagem, that interacts with this other thing,
course, yeah.
that actually is having, like, any one of those things themselves is fun, but it's kind of like the compounding effect of those things, almost like the compound interest that those things are creating, those synergies. And actually what you might be able to do is just knock one brick out of that kind of particular structure, and suddenly all of those things are fine. So quite often when you see kind of commentary, you know, in the wider community, it's like, oh, these 50 things need to change in this book, you know, because all of these units, and you're like, actually, there's a precision thing you can do. You can go in, like keyhole surgery, go in, make that change there, and actually that affects all of these kind of effects.
A quote that I love from Mark Rosewater, who is the head designer of Magic the Gathering, is the community is good at identifying problems with your game, but are terrible at fixing them. And it seems like that's what Stu's talking about here. There's a much greater emotional investment from a player base to the components of their game than there is from the designers. And that might seem strange, but essentially the game designer's job is to be objective and be able to analyze changes objectively. Whereas a player feels like if they play against something broken, oftentimes the immediate response is to want that thing to be nerfed into the ground so you don't have to deal with it anymore. That's not what a designer wants to have happen with their game, and is something that I appreciate that we had mentioned here, because I do think in the past Games Workshop has nerfed things in a heavy-handed fashion. They've been much better about it more recently in their data slate updates, where things have been just sort of getting little tweaks and not necessarily sort of cowing to this community pressure to really destroy things. Leagues of Votann, you know, maybe saw that kind of thing happen, but that I think was maybe a bit of a special case.
So when you're playtesting armies, does that mean you sort of look at the Space Marines as sort of as the benchmark of where other things should be, or is it you look at all the armies together, or how's that work?
Yeah, a bit of both.
Yeah.
And we're getting more and more sophisticated as time goes by at using models and using kind of mathematical tools as well. There's an awful lot of statistics and number crunching that goes on, and to look at relative damage outputs and damage output per points and all kinds of other stuff that stats nerds will love.
Is there a spreadsheet?
There is more than one, and also a developing database. So there's a load of mathematical tools that we use.
That's pretty good to hear, and I hope that we see it represented in future
social kind of
future
experience.
releases.
And the numbers tell you a bunch of stuff, but they're not the whole picture. You know, there's a lot more to the game than just the maths. The maths is ace. Some of us love it, but it's not. That's not the game, right? The game is a social contract. It's two people meeting up and playing a game of Warhammer. And what you want is to create a really fun experience. That experience being fair is part of that, but we could make a really, really boring fair game. Do you know? And I don't want to play it.
Rock, paper, scissors instead.
Exactly. There's a reason why, rock, paper, scissors is not an exciting hobby.
Ooh.
It does.
Just throwing shade at the international rock, paper, scissors community there. If you are a competitive rock, paper, scissors player, my heart goes out to you. It's time to rise up against Games Workshop and the fact that they don't appreciate your hobby. I think this is a good point. This is a point about sort of perfect imbalance. One thing that is important in game design is not having everything be perfectly balanced, because at that point you stagnate the metagame, which is what they're talking about in this article and this video. As soon as nothing is more powerful than anything else, there's no longer a reason to adapt to new input. So keeping everything balanced is important, but also making sure that it's not the same, and almost that it's not entirely balanced, is basically equally important. Having a new faction be more powerful than an old faction in a way that's interesting and forces players to move out of their comfort zone keeps the game interesting, and especially as a lifestyle game like Warhammer 40,000 is, which is one that wants to take the majority of your luxury time. Having a metagame that stagnates because everything is at the same power level and you don't have to adapt to new challenges means that your time feels like it's being wasted. Whereas new codexes coming out and creating problems that you have to solve makes the game intellectually stimulating for people who want to interact with it that way.
Tell me, right, what people really kind of want to know is what's the future, what's next, what the matter, what's any changes.
Codex spindle drones,
so,
please.
We're not far off the next data slate, so weeks away.
Oh, I guess we could talk about data slates.
As I alluded to, we've got four factions we're looking at intervening, 2 that need a bit of help, and 2 that need a little bit of a tap on the head. We're still looking at the data for that. We're pretty sure we know what we're going to do, but we've still got 2 more weeks. We'll wait as long as possible before we make those decisions.
Cool.
Sounds like we have a basically definitive date for our next data slate 2 weeks from today. Obviously today being October 6th, the date of recording and hopefully publishing of this video. So we're looking at October 20th as the date of an actual data slate. Although this video may have been recorded in the past, so probably 2 weeks as a soft cap. We may see a little bit sooner.
So great, we've got a new balanced data slate coming really soon, which is something to look forward to. That's really cool.
Sure.
Hell yes!
Stu, it's an absolute pleasure talking to you so much. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Guys, thank you for watching MetaWatch, and join us next time.
And that is it. I skipped a couple parts of the interview there, mostly talking about the methods of analysis and some of the statistical anomalies that come from having more or less players playing a certain faction that I talked about previously in the article. But overall, I'm actually pretty happy about this video. I think it does show a little bit more of a competency to Games Workshop development. They do talk about actually doing development on the game. One thing that I've criticized 40k for in the past is not actually having a development team and being focused on design, meaning that essentially they're very focused on creating new products and new data sheets, but less good at spending time balancing them. It seems like most of their balancing happens on the back end with these data slate releases, and I don't love that quite as much as having things balanced before they get released. But on the time frame that Games Workshop seems like they're working on, that being 2-ish years, part of that probably because they have to make printed materials. Codex is out of this game, dude. But that makes it understandable that they would be balancing for a metagame that no longer exists, and the data slates are a much better opportunity to implement useful changes to the game. But overall, I was really impressed with Stu Black. He seems like a really competent guy. A lot of the stuff he talked about makes a ton of sense, and it does seem like they're using actual, a lot of real statistical analysis to improve Warhammer 40,000. Now, obviously, I'm not sponsored by Warhammer or Games Workshop, and hopefully not too much of a shill for them, and I do think that they have to do a better job in some instances, but it was cool to watch a video from Games Workshop that talks about game design and game balancing that didn't sound like they had no idea what they were talking about. So pretty excited. I hope we see Stu and this style of design video in the future. It would be cool to kind of get to know their design team a little bit better and have a bit more of a personal relationship with the company as a whole. But overall, pretty excited about this article. I'm also excited about the new data slate. Sounds like it's going to be coming in 2 weeks. And it sounds like they've locked in some nerfs for Harlequins and Tyranids. More nerfs for Harlequins, poor guys. As well as some buffs for Adeptus Astartes and Adeptus Mechanicus. Very exciting to see those factions change. And obviously, we're facing down the barrel of a couple new codexes. Leagues of Votann are still releasing. Astra Militarum are right around the corner, and those factions will see, I think, big impacts on the meta as a whole. So it's a very exciting time for Warhammer. I think we're in a really balanced state right now, and I don't think that's going to change anytime in the not-too-distant future, especially with the new nerfs to the Leagues of Votann. And with that, I'll go ahead and wrap up the video. Thanks, everyone, for watching all the way to the end. Big thanks to everyone who supports the channel, either over on Patreon, at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. Also, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers, all you people are great. I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.